G'day guys. This video will pose the question, is modern Alzheimer's, dementia and other neurodegenerative diseases due to a choline deficiency? Well, let me share the screen. So this is an article back in August the 6th, 2019. It's basically just a review of a specific study in Science Daily. The source of the study was undertaken at the University of East Finland. And pretty much a new study by researchers at the University of East Finland in the first to observe the dietary intake of phosphatidylcholine is associated with a reduced risk of dementia. So this was the first time that they've actually looked at the question of we'll call it for PC, phosphatidylcholine is also sort of sometimes referred as PC in the sort of the medical literature, just for short. If you hear me say PC, that's what I mean. Is associated with reduced risk of dementia. And phosphatidylcholine was also linked to enhanced cognitive performance. The main dietary sources of phosphatidylcholine were eggs and meat. Obviously, they're the best sources. The findings were published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Choline is an essential nutrient usually occurring in foods in various compounds. I mean, you can get it in lecithin and you can get it in a number of other different compounds. It varies in the different compounds in other, different related foods, but generally speaking, all the different forms are predominant and in larger quantities in animal foods. Choline is also necessary for the formation of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, a very important one as well. Let's not forget that phosphatidylcholine is a phospholipid and very important for cell membranes. But let's move on. Early studies have linked choline intake with cognitive processing. That was based on, remember the previous study which we looked at the speed in which the kids that had more animal foods, their brains perform faster because those foods are rich in choline. Cognitive processing and adequate choline intake may play a role in the prevention of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. In fact, choline is nowadays used in a multi-nutrient medical drink intended for the treatment of early onset Alzheimer's. Yes, they're actually using choline in a medical drink, a preparation. So they know it's important to basically slow down. And these medical drinks, I can tell you, are pricey, produced by Big Pharma for very good profits, when sources like eggs, organ meats, and muscle meats, which are filled with choline, are much cheaper and healthier for you because they provide and furnish the body with a whole lot of other important nutrients, not only choline. The new study now shows that the risk of dementia was 28% lower in men with the highest intake of dietary phosphatidylcholine when compared to men with the lowest intake, I suspect. And that's, they're looking at a general population. They're not looking at specifically people in plant-based world. And I suspect people on a plant-based diet would have even lower levels. Horrifying, to say the least. Also, excelled in tests measuring their memory and linguistic abilities. These findings are significant. Yes, they were. Considering that more than 50 million people worldwide are suffering from a memory disorder, that has led to dementia, and a number of expected to grow as the population ages. Not exactly. If we go back in history and look at older people, they were considered wise and mentors of the younger people, not demented and locked up in nursing homes for their own good. Yes, a very different era back then when the older were venerated for their lifelong experiences and knowledge. Nowadays, because of dementia and Alzheimer's, they are being stripped of their memories, stripped of the ability for their minds to function properly. We'll go into the things that are driving this. Anyway, the new and they pretty much say Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, for which no cure currently exists. It's actually called meat and eggs. It's a simple cure. I can't actually, this is a personal opinion of mine, that when you give the species its species appropriate diet, it usually corrects a lot of these issues. They go away. But this is not medical advice, and I don't have a longitudinal study where we've locked in people and tested them. We can only go on anecdotes of ancient populations and tribal populations that don't exhibit either Alzheimer's or dementia into old age. They are quite well, healthy and all that on their ancestral diet, and they die with still their full marbles intact. The new findings may therefore play a vital role in the prevention of dementia. Successful dementia prevention is a sum of many things, and this question, even small individual factors, can have a positive effect on the overall risk, possibly by preventing or delaying the disease onset. It's called meat and eggs. However, this is just one observational study. Yes, it is, but they did focus on taking measurements of people who basically ended up in hospital and all that with dementia and stuff like that, and check their levels. So they did look at least those biomarkers. So they look at the biomarkers of people. So it is an observational study, but like the tobacco studies, when you're only looking at one factor, there's not many compounding, there's not many compounding possible variables that could be at play. I sort of think that there are two key factors that are happening. One is primarily the diet, which is deficient in key nutrients that the body needs that are very high in animal foods. And the other is a number of the pharmaceuticals that we use today that also have some negative effects in this regard. But let's continue, and that's further down the track. We will go into those areas. However, this is just, as she said, and we need further research before any definitive conclusions can be drawn. Meija Yili Luri, it's a Finnish name. Sorry if I really mispronounced that for my Finnish friends, but it's not my first language. That is not my language. So yes, I probably really, yes, do apologize. A PhD student at the University of East Finland points out, now obviously all academics, and even they get it drummed in, they always say we need more research. Obviously, we need the funding, we need the tenure. Yes. The data of the study were derived from the Kuopio Ischemic Heart Disease Risk Factor Study, KIHD for short. At the onset of the study in 1984 to 1989, researchers analysed approximately 2,500 Finnish men aged between 42 and 60 for their dietary lifestyle habits and health in general. These data were combined with hospital records, cause of death records, and medication reimbursement records after an average follow-up period of 22 years. In addition, 4 years after the study onset, approximately 500 men completed tests measuring their memory and cognitive processing. During the follow-up, 337 men developed dementia. Appalling. Yes, the numbers are escalating and getting worse every year, unfortunately. It varies between country, let's put it that way. The analysis extensively accounted for other lifestyles and nutritional related factors and could have explained the observed associations. In addition, the ApoE gene, which predisposes to Alzheimer's disease and is common in the Finnish population, especially the tribal type population, was accounted for, showing no significant impact on the findings. So it's not the main reason. I mean, if you're got ancestral gene, those type of genes, you tend to be more vulnerable, but it doesn't mean that everybody else is off the hook. You still need you may be more vulnerable, but you still need the certain amount of nutrition to basically create some of these neurotransmitters. Otherwise, they just don't happen. Got it? The key source of the key sources of phosphatidylcholine in the study population diet were eggs and meat, because they are the best sources. Anyway, that's the study, the association of dietary choline intake with the risks of incidence dementia and with cognitive performance. So in the QOPO is ischemic heart disease risk factor study, and I'll link that so people can take a look at it. This is not an extensive thing, and also they don't cover some of and this sort of generalized thing is really bad, because really there's very few plant foods that have actually got this level. This is sort of like an intake, a daily intake. So from what I can see is these people are taking quite a few plants as intake in their diet. So, but again, if you take a look at where people are getting most of the phosphatidylcholine, they're getting it from eggs and they're getting it from meat. That's the main sources. You don't get much from all these other sources of food. Okay, so just to keep that in mind. Now, I'll just cover this other very important point. And this is a study that goes back a number of years, around about 2000 in Vienna. That's Austria, for those who don't know where that place is. Membrane breakdown in acute and chronic neurodegeneration. Focus on choline-containing phospholipids. Yes, remember, phosphatidylcholine is one of those. Anyway, breakdown of cellular membrane is a characteristic feature of neural degeneration in acute stroke and chronic neurological disorders. And chronic neurological disorders is basically senile dementia. The present review summarizes recent experimental and clinical work with concentrations on changes of choline-containing phospholipids as indicators of neural membrane breakdown. Experimental studies identified glutamate release, calcium influx, and activation of cellular phospholipase A2-PLA2 as an important step initiating membrane breakdown in cultured neurons on brain slices under hypoxic or ischemic conditions. That means lack of oxygen, sufficient oxygen. Proton NMR studies have shown an elevation of choline-containing compounds in the brain of Alzheimer's patients, with neurochemical studies in post-mortem brain demonstrating increase of catabolic metabolites, glycosinophocholine, an indicator of PLA2 activation. In contrast studies of cerebral spinal fluid, NMR studies, and measurements of phospholipases in post-mortem. So basically people that are dead. Alzheimer's brain gave ambiguous result, which may be explained by methodological limitations. The findings, that is experimental studies, choline was a rate limiting factor for phospholipid biosynthesis, has simulated clinical studies aimed at counteracting phospholipid breakdown. This is really important, this last note, that choline is rate limiting. So it's a very important element. If you don't have enough choline, you can't biosynthesize enough phospholipid you can't, your brain is full of phospholipids. It requires them for the integrity of basically cellular membranes. So if you can't produce enough, there's a rate limiting effect with not enough choline, you got a problem. Also, if you think about it, if you're doing a diet which is very high, you don't need an animal-based diet. I've talked about this before. People that have low methionine tend to have higher homocysteine levels. That means higher homocysteine levels that you find in communities on plant-based diets will also bleed through choline, which means that then you've got a rate limiting capacity to actually produce these phospholipids. Got it? So by combinations of choline and cytidine, they were able to prevent a lot of this. Future experimental approaches should clarify whether loss of membrane phospholipids is cause or consequence of neurodegenerative disease processes. So they can see the outcome of deficient choline deficiency, but they're not sure exactly whether it's a direct cause and effect. The mechanistic stuff they haven't determined yet exactly, but we know that choline is an important factor playing. When there's less of it, there's a rate limiting factor. That means, not enough choline, that enzyme that basically produces, that biosynthesizes phospholipids to basically maintain good cellular membranes, doesn't really work that well. And so either you're not eating enough, or you're too inflamed and you're using too much as part of methylation, or you're basically using other pharmaceuticals that are reducing it as well, then you've got a problem. Exactly. Houston, we've got a problem. We're not getting enough for the body. Now, this is the situation. That's the beginning, 1979 to 2012. This is the study. It's out of neurology, which is an American Academy of Neurology. So it's a prestigious magazine in the field of neurology. And this is the study. And they've basically looked from 1979 right through to 2012. And you can see this massive growth in Alzheimer's in the population in this place in Minnesota. So in this county, Olmsted. I don't know the place, don't ask me where it is, but they were looking at people through this era to see what's happening. And we've seen an explosion. That is an exposure to something. It's not genetics. Anybody that thinks that's genetics is a complete and utter fool. You cannot get genetic changes that acute. This is an acute exposure. Any scientist who says that this is not an acute exposure, this is genetics, really should be handing their license in. Genetics can make things worse, yes, but they're not the cause of disease. Genetics can just predispose you to worse outcomes. They don't actually drive the disease. You know, these genes have been around for a long time. They weren't causing Alzheimer's. You know, it's just in the modern era when we changed the food diet. So when we changed the food pyramid in the mid-70s, and the recommendation was to lower the animal foods, and we lowered eggs, we lowered meat, we eliminated organ meats completely, which are very high in choline and other phospholipids and a whole lot of other key nutrients. And pretty much we moved into the in a very profound way, in a very carb-centric food eating pattern or model, whatever you want to call it, but which is deficient in key nutrients, and one of them being choline. And as you can see, things have got very bad. These are basically, this is another area, West Virginia, between 1984 to 2003. Again, here you can see very low levels and then an explosion through this period. And there again, that's that one is dementia, and Alzheimer's is quite high here. That's a period, I think the medication in that period that may have had an effect, but they did have toxic side effects, so they had to eliminate them in that regard. So this site provides additional information about mortality rates as well, and general information about that whole region as well. So, you know, and that's the mortality rates. You can see when we hit basically the early 90s onwards, the mortality rate from Alzheimer's really started accelerating. And these are in the different groups. So if anybody comes from that region and is interested in that sort of data, I'll put the link and they can look at it. Okay. Now, another factor, another thing that actually increased through this period as well, especially from the 90s, mid 90s. It sort of started earlier in the 80s, but you know, statins have been researched right back in the 60s, I believe, from memory. I could be wrong. Don't hold me to that. But they really took off through this whole period, and as you can see, they pretty much. Yes, you could overlap. You could overlap the you know, a number of people have done this. I mean, I don't have creative software to do it, but you can go away. This is prescriptions. This is in England. The problem with prescriptions that I find a bit of a problem is that it's really hard to know whether people are getting certain people are getting more, you know, so it's a bit. But generally speaking, you know, we've seen a massive increase in statins and doctors pushing them left, right, and center. I mean, a lot of you guys would have experienced going to the GP and being encouraged or cajoled or, you know, pressured to some degree to basically get on a statin. I mean, there was a period of time when they actually wanted to put it in the water. Can you believe that? There were actual doctors that recommended this. How crazy is that? You know, mad stuff, you know, definitely mad scientists. Okay, so the food definitely is deficient in choline, and that is definitely a factor that's playing here in seeing this explosion in dementia and Alzheimer's, that basically the body's not getting what it needs. But could there be other factors that are actually exacerbating this, magnifying this thing? And the reason why we see that sort of, you know, this is the mid 70s. Oops. You know, when we're looking down here, we see this sort of, it's going up and then it sort of explodes to these bigger numbers. Could there be another factor that's actually called statins that's actually driving this even faster, at a faster rate? Let's take a look. This is a study, effects of simvastatin a cholesterol synthesis inhibitor. Yes, yes, one of those. A HMG CoA reductase inhibitor. Yes, one of those wonderful things. On phosphatidylcholine. Ah, now we're getting somewhere. Synthesis in HepG2 cells. This is an old study, goes right back to the 1st of March, 1994. So already, this is the mid-90s. Statins that had started about a decade earlier, I believe, from memory, when they started getting really pushed. And they started noticing, ooh, there's some issues here. And they started researching this. So they knew about this a long, long time ago. Let's see this study. 2021 minus 1994, 27 years, nearly 3 decades since this study appeared, and completely ignored by those who you would expect should not be ignoring this sort of stuff and the risks to the population. Because there are other things like niacin and other things that can actually have similar effects without basically making you demented or increasing your possibilities of basically becoming. Anyway, the effects, we know quite clearly that low choline levels, we've shown mechanistically, it's quite clear. Choline deficiency drives dementia, all these sort of things. Reductions in animal foods are driving it. But are statins basically magnifying the effect? I believe so. This is what this study has actually shown. The effects of the addition of 3-hydroxyl 3-methyl coenzyme A. So that's the reductase inhibitor. Simvastatin to the medium of sterol synthesis and phosphatidylcholine synthesis were studied in G2 cells. The cells were cultured with this poison. Simvastatin is not only a mitochondrial poison, but I think it's a systemic poison to the body. That's my personal opinion based on all what this study has shown and what other things have shown quite clearly. That's my personal belief, but I stand by it. And the reality is statins have only been able to show a 1% improvement. Absolute numbers. They put it in small writing. The actual pharmaceutical companies in there where they say, oh, it reduces, cardiovascular disease by 38% or 37% or whatever. Can't remember the exact one of those it is. But when you see the small writing, that's a relative risk. That's a relative, the absolute outcomes is 1%, which is basically just statistical noise, neither here or there. Who knows? It may be just the anti-inflammatory effect, the slight, if that, we don't know. It could just be that those other people had other confounding variables like smoking more or whatever. So we don't know what that 1% is, so it's irrelevant. It's so little, the effect. It's laughable, basically. So they use concentrations of the statin of 10 to the minus 7 and 10 to the minus 6 of mole per liter for 6 hours. And they also added to that a radioactive lipid precursor were added 1 hour before harvesting, before they took the samples to see what exactly happened. Simvastatin inhibited cholesterol synthesis from 14-carbon acetate in a dose-dependent manner. Yes, we know that's what it's supposed to do. Otherwise, that's what they promoted as being doing. It also, and this is the important one for us, decreased the incorporation of 14 carbon choline into phosphatidylcholine, PC, by 30%. This decrease was accompanied by a decrease in phosphatidylcholine, citidyltransferase activity in cell homogenesis. Simvastatin had no significant effect on the incorporation of 6-hydrogen glycerol into phospholipids. These data indicated that simvastatin has two different functions: inhibition of HMG-CoA reductase, which we know, cholesterol synthesis, and depression of de novo synthesis. That means inside the body, synthesis of PC via the citidine diphosphate choline enzymatic pathway, which in turn may result in a decreased plasma lipid levels. Phospholipids, think in terms of PCs. So basically, this is quite clear. They've actually demonstrated mechanistically that you can actually reduce by 30%. So this experiment can be done over and over and over, that you get the same result. Basically, it inhibits, this enzyme, which means you get a 30% reduction. So just think, we're on deficient diets as it is, adding another 30% reduction to choline, or the ability to produce the important precursors that we need for the brain. Not a good thing. Remember this study? Breakdown of cellular membranes due to the lack of the stuff, due to the lack of choline and phospholipids. Remember, phosphatidylcholine, very important there. The biosynthesis of phospholipids is a rate limiting thing. And this poison is basically inhibiting this pathway and reducing. That's what's happening. So it's not enough that we actually eat deficient diets. We're actually, on top of that, being given poisons that basically, systemic poisons as I call them, to the body, that basically are actually undermining the ability to synthesize these important, compounds for the body. This is just crazy stuff, If you told somebody that governments are basically authorizing and encouraging through their guidelines to doctors to basically, cause a deficiency in choline and cause a deficiency in phosphatidylcholine and cause brain, most people would look at you and say, no, impossible. But the problem is that's exactly what's happened with the food guidelines and the crazy pyramid that we were forced onto, and then the addition of statins. We magnified the problem, and we've ended up with a big growth in Alzheimer's, and it's getting worse. I mean, some people are predicting that Alzheimer's will be number one killer in the future, and the number one basically, health problem. It's horrifying. And all you need to do is eat eggs and meat. And what are we being recommended? Oh no, we're having too much of that stuff. We have to go 100% plant-based. Yes, let's just completely and utterly degenerate ourselves, completely and utterly brain fog ourselves to such a level and damage ourselves to such a level where we're not losing our marbles at 60, but we're losing our marbles at 30. This is the new sort of what's coming from above. It is absolutely criminal, and it's absolutely crazy that we live at a time that basically, key nutrients, people are told not to access key nutrients. because they're being demonized. And then on top of that, we're giving people medical poison to magnify the problem. It's absolutely crazy. If you've got friends or relatives, please share this video with them. Let them know what the situation is, how they've been duped, and how their doctors have been misled by, big pharma manipulating the political establishment, because that's what's happening. This is my personal opinion. This is not medical advice. This is basically Harry Sopanos' opinion. But basically, people need to wise up. I've talked about taurine, how it plays a big role in also a lot of this sort of stuff. And the biosynthesis drops, declines, especially after 50 and onwards. So this is an important thing you people need to understand. So you need to incorporate taurine as well. The other thing is choline sufficient. So there's food sources. There's don't go for the actual, avoid the sort of like the simple sort of cheap choline types, because they tend to be a problem. They basically can't get through the tartrate ones and all that, because they can't get through the actual blood-brain barrier, or well, a bit, but very inefficient. So there's the alpha GPC, I think it's called, and that can, and the other one is the CDP choline, the one that I've talked about within the studies. So, which I've sort of covered that anyway. And that, remember, also has that other element, which is the cytidine element. That's high in organ meats primarily, and in eggs, but primarily in organ meats. And that's also another element that plays a big, big role in your brain, in the membranes of the cells, the brain cells. So the take-home message is eat your eggs and meat. And if you've actually had some damage and stuff like that, you may have to supplement. We were not born in an ancestral diet and continued in an ancestral lifestyle. We basically came to this understanding later in life after we've sustained quite a bit of damage. Others, maybe in their 60s or 70s, have sustained quite a bit. They may have to supplement far more in that regard. So I've talked about the dosages before. Try to get about 2 grams in from food and supplemental, depending on your circumstances. Also taurine, make sure you get some taurine in there, a couple of grams of that. Also keep in mind, these do affect blood pressure. So if you're on blood pressure meds, always get the doctor to adjust your meds and start slow and increase. That goes for all this sort of stuff, because they rapidly come in and they can change slightly the blood pressure in your body. So keep that in mind. So generally speaking, the take-home message of this is eat an ancestral diet and fend off the ravages of aging, so you can maintain long-term health span and then rapidly decline like our ancestors used to, due to massive senescence right at the end because of no more cell division. That's how you're supposed to live and die, not basically chronically, slowly dying and suffering severely. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Do please pass it on to a plant-based friend of yours, because they are at the highest risk, because they eat less of this important nutrient, and they also are probably being brainwashed to believe that statins are great. So hope you enjoyed it. See yous.